tonight we're here to talk about Blueprint, and this evening is just kind of a natural progression of where we were last year. And if you were here last year this time at some of the town halls that I did, you'll remember that I was introducing the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. This is the legislation that was passed through the Maryland General Assembly in 2022 and is now law. What is the Blueprint? Well, it aims to transform public education in the state of Maryland. And its aim is to improve education for our students, improve education outcomes for all of our students, and to transform the industry of teaching and education in Maryland so that more and more people will choose a career in the field of education. If you haven't noticed, there have been fewer and fewer folks who are choosing education, choosing teaching as a career. And that has been an issue for not only us, but all of the counties in Maryland and all across the nation right now. So it really is a challenge that the Blueprint is trying to meet. So where are we now? Let's look at fiscal compliance. So last year, if you'll recall, I posted a chart and the chart got a lot of conversation. It was about how many staff members schools would have. And it looked at some schools having less staff members, some schools having more staff members. And we talked about the fact that we would be having to pull some staff from some schools and transfer them to some other schools. And we'll get to that in tonight's presentation a little bit later. But basically, everyone was concerned, and I was concerned at the time, that we would be doing that for next school year. At this point, we don't have to be in full compliance with that part of the plan for next school year, but we do have to be in compliance with it for the school year after. So we're going to spend this summer and next school year looking at what staff we may need to move from some schools to other schools. And I'm sure you'll have some questions about that later in the evening with the Q&A. But basically, the state is not going to impose the penalties that we thought they may impose for us not being there for next school year. So we will also be looking at next school year as the baseline. So next year, we're turning in all of our data, and then from there, the state will look at how we get into compliance with the Blueprint legislation. So we're looking at as a baseline year, and then we will need to make progress toward the Blueprint goals in years after. So each school system has to develop a local implementation plan to show that each year we are gaining more and more of a foothold to be in compliance with the Blueprint legislation. The AIB, which is the Accountability and Implementation Board, it's a state board that oversees all of the districts in Maryland and how we're doing at implementing Blueprint. They've given us a more comprehensive template to use so that we can be even more specific as we go on from year to year as to the steps we're taking to get into compliance. It looks back at our accomplishments, but it also allows us to set multi-year goals, which will be helpful for us. Also, all of our future state funding will be dependent upon our successful progress under the plan. So we get part of our funding for the school system from the state and part of it from local government. And so we need to make sure that we're in compliance with Blueprint in order to be able to maintain our state funding. Last year, one of the questions I received, and you might remember this, is, well, if a parent doesn't like some of the aspects of Blueprint, do we have to do it? I got that question a lot. Do we really have to do that part? And the answer is yes, we do. we really have to implement all of the parts of Blueprint and show that we're doing that, prove that we're making progress toward all of those parts. Because if we don't, the bottom line is we don't have to receive the state funding that we need in order to run the school system. So it's very important that we do implement. Okay. We also have our AIB strategic facilitator here tonight. Thank you, Frank. And Frank has already started to meet with different stakeholder groups. I know he's met with groups of parents. He's met with groups of students. So he's gathering information. He's also helping us with the struggles and challenges that we have to meet all of the goals of Blueprint. So it's very, very nice for us to have someone who is attached to the AIB and attached to us so that we can have questions and guidance going back and forth. It's been very helpful. Okay, so at this point, I want to let you know about where we are with each of the pillars of the Blueprint, or the areas of work that the Blueprint has us working on or doing. Pillar 1 is early childhood. So we have expanded to full day pre-kindergarten at all of our existing pre-kindergarten sites. And we are very proud of that. We have given more seats to students, and we've expanded the amount of time that they're with us. Also, our capital improvement plan includes planning and requests to build additions at all elementary schools to achieve the public share of the required pre-K slots. So as you can imagine, if we're going to increase pre-K first to 4-year-olds and then eventually to 3-year-olds, that requires space. It not only requires teachers and staff, but space. And right now, our schools are very full. And then thirdly, we don't have enough private pre-Ks right now for the pre-K providers to achieve all of the slots that we are supposed to have as a system. So right now we don't have a lot of pre-K providers in our area, and only some of the providers can connect with us and partner with us. They have to meet certain conditions for the state. And so right now, I think we have 2 private partnerships that we're working with. We're trying to continue to develop more. And that way, through the private pre-Ks and what we can offer as a school system, we're hoping to be able to better meet the needs of our community. So let's look at pillar 2. This is the pillar that really tries to make a dent in the profession of teaching and education, trying to professionalize it, make it better for those who are looking for careers, deciding what to go into. So we and our teachers union, CCEA, are finalizing the framework for a required career ladder. And what that means is Blueprint wants it to be a career to be a teacher. Right now, if you're a teacher, it's pretty much flat. You're a teacher for the rest of your career. But through Blueprint, it makes teaching into a career ladder. So you could end up being in time and with expertise and working through different programs. You could end up being a mentor teacher, a lead teacher. So there are different rungs of a ladder that a teacher could aspire through. And right now we are working with the teachers union to get that finalized, which is a huge piece of the Blueprint, and I think one that will help attract and retain more teachers in Carroll County. Secondly, we are working with our union to get to a minimum of $60,000 starting salary. That is in the law. We have to get there. We're working to get there now, and that's part of the project to make teaching a real career choice. We want people to go into the field and feel like they can afford to support a family on a teacher's salary. Thirdly, we're working with our APSASCO bargaining unit, which is another name for our administrators and supervisors. So our assistant principals, our curriculum supervisors, to work on their career ladder as well. And then finally, this is all contingent upon the funding that we get from our county commissioners. So we are putting forth, and we're in the middle of budget season right now, so we're putting forth the funding that we need, and then the commissioners will determine how much they can fund us for next school year. And they have to think about everything else that they have to fund as well as the school system. So it's a hard job for us to come up with our budget and our needs, and it's a difficult task for them to determine what they can fund us and all of the other institutions that need local funding. Okay, let's move on to pillar 3. This pillar, or this area, is one that focuses on making sure that when students graduate from our schools, from high school, they are college and career ready. So we want our students, when they leave us, to meet with success in college or leave us and go right into the workforce and be successful there and have a job that is a good, well-paying job. So this, our state board has adopted a new college and career ready standard, and this was just adopted in January. And the new standard considers multiple factors, and they're up on the screen. So in order for a student to be considered college and career ready, they have to have a GPA of 3.0 or higher, and a grade of C or higher in Algebra 1, or proficient or above score on Algebra 1 MCAP, or be proficient or above score on the ELA 10 and Algebra 1 MCAP. Now, this new standard is a little tougher than the standard was before. And so there's a bit of a gap right now, and we have to work with our students to get them to this new level of a standard. The other challenge that we're facing right now is this proposed standard doesn't necessarily address our CTE students. And what I mean by that is we have some students currently here in this beautiful new building who may be in, let's say, a masonry program or a construction program or a heavy machinery program, and they may not meet these new standards, but they are being very successful in our programs here, and they're meeting with the certifications that they need to go out and work from here. So these are conversations that need to keep occurring with the state and with the AIB to look and see, is there the possibility that in time we could have, we could take into consideration our students who are going into career in tech and then going right into a career, because they may not currently meet these new standards. Okay, pillar 4, more resources for all students. This is where the rubber meets the road, and this is of funding, and this is what we talk a lot about. So we have some fiscal compliance concerns with the way that the blueprint is funded. And last year I kind of explained it, and I'm gonna try my best to explain it again. Right now, when we get our state and our local dollars, it goes into a pot, and then we decide where it's going to go from there. And you can imagine we have everything to fund. We've got to fund, we've got to fund HVAC. We have to make sure that our schools are well heated and air conditioned. We've got to make sure that our buses are running and that we have diesel fuel, and we've got to make sure that our employees have health insurance, and we've got to make sure that we have enough teachers and we have enough materials in the classroom. So all of that money goes toward paying for everything that a school system has to pay for in order to operate. Through Blueprint, Blueprint states that the funding or the money that we currently have, that we're currently spending on all kinds of different things, we have to take 38.9 million of that and spend that on compensatory education, which is services for students who are economically disadvantaged. It says that we have to take 2.3 million that we may be spending in other ways and service our English language learners, and so on and so on and so on. And I don't think anyone is thinking that our populations of kids couldn't use that extra funding. We could definitely put that funding to good use for the students in those student groups. Our issue is right now, because of how lean of a system we are, we don't have anything to take from anywhere and give to a school that's got lots of kids that fall into these different groups. So this is where we start talking about perhaps taking some resources from some schools to give to other schools. And I have an example of that coming up. Our implementation plan, though, must include strategies for compliance for these areas. So basically, we have to show how we're going to take our funding and take 38.9 million of it to put into comp ed or to put into students who are economically disadvantaged. We also, under Pillar 4, are implementing our first community schools. Right now, those two schools are Crossroads Middle and Tawnytown Elementary. And what this means, what a community school is, apart from everything else on the top of that screen, a community school will be a school that qualifies to have extra wraparound services. So let's just take Tawnytown, for instance. That school will have access to probably a dental program, a medical program. It could have access, the school could have access to mental health providers that other schools don't have access to. So the purpose of a community school is to get needed services to students who may not otherwise be able to access those services. Okay, now let's look at a little more detail about the Blueprint per pupil funding. So the Blueprint changes our funding formula, and it changes it for all the districts, not just Carroll County. But let's look at the row called FY24, and we'll just go through that row. The amount this year that we get per pupil from the state is $8,642. The next number over just says that that's a little over 300 more than we got the year before per student. But here's the part that really tells the story. If you go over to the column that says comp ed, remember, this is for kids who are economically disadvantaged. So if you're a kid and you are economically disadvantaged and you fall into that comp ed category, we're now going to get $8,642 plus $7,519 for that student. If you keep going across, if that student is an English language learner, we're going to get $8,642, or we're going to spend $8,642 more on that student. And then if they're a student that requires special education services, we're going to need to put in $7,951. So then this is just a scenario. If there were a child who was economically disadvantaged, was an English language learner, and qualified for special education services, we would need to spend on them $8,642 plus $7,519 plus $86.42 plus $79.51. Okay, that's how that plays out. And you can see each of the years going down the screen, how that will look in each of the subsequent years. We also must show that 75% of this funding is going to the school that that child attends. And again, that's where we start getting into one school might have more staff or more resources than another school. And now let's look at a scenario. So we made up 4 fake schools. These are totally fake. Some people will say, which school is school A? Really, there is no school A, or B, C, or D. We're making this up just for the purposes of understanding. So right now, each of these schools, A, B, C, and D, would get approximately $5.5 million to run the school today, because today we fund schools pretty much on an equal basis. With Blueprint, because it's not an equality basis, it's an equity basis to how we fund, let's look at how that changes how we will fund each of these schools. Let's look at School A. School A has 500 students, just like all of the other schools. And right now, it has, let's say, it would get funded $4 million, and it would get funded that way because each of the students would get their per pupil funding, which is, let's say, about $8,000. They don't have any students who are economically disadvantaged. They don't have any students who are English language learners, and they don't have any students who receive special education services. Again, fake school. So they would end up with their total funding being just a little over $4 million. Okay? Now, let's go all the way down to School D, because that's the other extreme. In School D, they still have 500 students. They're still having the same per pupil funding for their 500 students, but they have 295 students who are economically disadvantaged. So they're going to get a little over $2 million more in funding for them. Again, we're not getting more funding. We have to figure out where that funding is coming from in the school system. School D also has 40 English language learners, let's say. That means that we need to give them $332,000 more for the English language learners students. And then let's say that School D has 75 students who are getting special education services. We would be required to give them $536,000 for those services, to provide those services. That means that School D, if you add all of those columns up, will be funded at a level of a little over $7 million. So this is what we're talking about. And B and C are somewhere in between, which most of our schools will be somewhere in between School A and D. But basically, it shows you that instead of funding each of our schools at about $5 million, we're going to be funding our schools based on an equity formula, and that's based on the student groups that are in those schools. So we could have a school that gets about $4 million in funding, and we could have another school that gets $7 million in funding. Again, this isn't new money. So in order to give the School D $7 million, it has to come from somewhere. So it will come from School A, who used to get a little over $5 million in funding. Okay, so that's another way of looking at a scenario. So, and this is the scenario that parents ask me about the most, is what is this going to look like if my school gets more resources or my school gets fewer resources? Okay. So those are the kind of the nuts and bolts of where we are with implementing the pillars of Blueprint right now. Again, as I said in the beginning, we don't have to make these changes for next school year like we thought we were going to. We are going to have this summer and next year to think through how we're going to move those resources around so that we are getting into compliance with Blueprint. What that is going to mean is we will be moving resources around. And so since most of our money is spent on staff, that means we will be moving staff around, and we will, I can guarantee you that we're going to do it in the most sensitive way that we can. We're going to do it, we're going to let people know as quickly as we can so that people can plan for what that might look like. Because we know that nobody likes a surprise, change is difficult for everyone. And so, but what we do hope is that everyone lands somewhere that they want to be. And we're also excited about the resources that that many of our students will have the opportunity to get under Blueprint, under the resources that we will be able to provide that we haven't been able to provide in the past. So, you know, when people say, is Blueprint good or is Blueprint bad? I always say, I think the ideas behind Blueprint are great. I think that teaching needs to be a career that more people want to go into, and it needs to be not just a rewarding career, but a career that can support a family. And I also think that Blueprint does a wonderful job of providing resources for students who may need more resources. The challenge or the struggle is that we've only got one pot of money here, one pot of funding, and we've got to make it all happen within that one pot. So that's where it can get a little complicated. So with that, just like last time, we're going to do some questions and answers. Again, I have cabinet members here to help me answer questions that you may have. And because this is being recorded, and we will be putting the link on the website, if you have a question, if you could come to the microphone that's sort of in the middle there and ask your question. And that way we can all hear the question and people at home will be able to hear it when the recording is put on the website. And don't be shy.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is, if we don't get enough funding from the county commissioners, what then is the next step? Where do we get that funding?
That's a great question. So if we don't get the amount that we're asking for from the commissioners for next school year, it will be like other budget seasons where, you know, we don't always get what we ask for. We hope that we do, and many years we get what we're asking for. If we don't, then we'll have to go back and look at what is it that we can cut that is not Blueprint related. We have to make sure that we are moving forward and implementing what we need to implement for Blueprint. But it could be other things in our system that we pay for, and I'll just give one example. But there are plenty of different items on the table for us to discuss. One item that we're discussing is the one-to-one laptops. You know, during COVID, we did one-to-one laptops for everyone, for all of our students. Our students are now used to that way of learning. We're looking at, do we need to continue to provide one-to-one laptops for our pre-kindergarten through second graders? What would that look like if we didn't provide them for those grades? How much money would that save? And how much would it impact instruction in the regular classroom? So that's just one example of something that is not Blueprint related that we may be able to cut or reduce so that we can pay for the other things that we need. Other questions?
Hi.
Hello.
I have a couple clarification questions from the slides.
Yeah.
One was, you talked in Pillar 3 about the grade C or higher and all that. What does that, that obviously there's going to be students that graduate with a 2.5 GPA. That doesn't mean they're not going to graduate. So it's going to affect our funding if we can't graduate everybody at a 3.0, or?
Great question.
Okay.
And I'm going to have Mr. Shockney come up and answer, our Assistant Superintendent of Instruction.
Great question. So that's the standard that's been set, and it is tied to funding. At this time, that whether a student meets the standard or not cannot impact their pathway that they establish. So we're working on, we have several pathways, but we're working on expanding and developing a clear CTE pathway, an AP pathway, and then a dual enrollment pathway. And as it stands currently, if a student hasn't met that CCR standard, they can still pursue those pathways, but it is directly tied to funding. We receive less funding. Obviously, the more students that are CCR that meet that standard, we receive the funding. But again, that has impacted us through funding.
Okay, thank you. On the next pillar, in the listing of the millions of dollars for different groups, under special ed, it says 25 million overspending, but
Yes.
the rest of them don't say overspending. So I'm trying to understand the difference there.
Yes. So this is very interesting. In the area of services for our special education students, when the state gave us the amounts of what we should or what we need to be spending for these various student groups, we were 25 million above what they said we should be. And so we're not the only system who is like that right now. So we're working with other systems to look at how that number was reached and what we might be able to do. What we know is that we have to provide the services that is in each child's IEP or individual education program. We can't not give those services. So we're looking at why the state is saying that we have an overage in that area, and understanding what that means, and do we need to somehow figure out a way to decrease that amount of money that we're spending there, or was there some kind of mistake or something that was made, in the calculations? So that's a great question.
Okay. And then lastly, it sounds like at the state level, there have been some concessions because we're not having to do this next year, so we've got a little extra time. Has there been any other concession made? Because I know we're not the only system in the state that is struggling with the implementation of all of this.
Right.
So has there been any other sort of give and take at the state level to make this not as dire as it sounded when we were having these meetings last year?
There hasn't been any kind of amendments to the law legislatively at this point. But what we're hearing from the AIB and from the Maryland State Department of Education is they're willing to work with us on timeline. And so it's just what you said. Instead of everything having to be done next year, they're looking at our total plan, our total implementation plan, and what we're looking to do year after year after year. And what they're telling us now is if they see improvement each year or appropriate steps toward meeting the blueprint goals, then we'll be in good shape. We're still looking for some specificity there. But no, there haven't been any other concessions. Right now, it's just the concession is looking at working with each system on timeline.
Do you know if there'd be any effect on advanced academics or gifted curriculum for students who do have that at this moment? Would that be compromised due to the cost shifting and that kind of thing?
I would say anything is possible. right now, that's not something that we're looking at. When you compare the resources that we spend for gifted and talented education, it is far less than most other districts spend for that. And so, in all honesty, there's not much we could take away right now from our gifted and talented resources. So that's not something that we're looking at right now. And that's something that we would certainly try to stay away from, as, we want to build on those services right now, not take away.
Good evening, Dr. McCabe. This is more informational purposes for the community members who are attending. I'm Cindy Porter, president of CASE, representing clerical assistants and LPNs in Carroll County. I'm one representative group of the education support professionals in our county. I'm a career educator in my 25th year. I've presented professional development to my peers locally, statewide, and now nationally. And I just wanted the community members to know that the blueprint and the significant financial implications for our county has no interest. There's nothing for education support professionals in the blueprint. No requirements for any minimum salary, no requirements for career ladders or anything else. And I'm also talking about my fellow ESPs in food services and maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. The only requirement in the entire law is for a pre-K assistant to have a certain certification or AA degree by a certain timeline. So when the financial implications hit and all the requirements to meet the constraints and parameters of this law, there is no financial consideration for your education support professionals who are in the classroom with your students every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. That's a good point. Any other questions?
Hi.
Hi
I have
there.
2 questions.
Okay.
Will Title I no longer be necessary because money will be for certain schools?
So this is on top of Title I. So Title I is a federal program. And so those dollars that we put into our schools that qualify for Title I services all come from the federal level. Blueprint, on the other hand, is state funding. So everything that we get for Title I will remain, and this will be on top of.
Oh, on top of?
Yes.
Okay.
It will not replace what we currently do with Title I.
Okay. And then in regards to Amy's question, our special ed kids that are certificate bound, if they don't get the 3.0, do we lose money for them, or are they a separate category because they have the IEP and the certification road?
Good question.
Thank you.
I'll let Mr. Shockney answer that.
Thanks.
It's all students in the count. However, our students who are pursuing a certificate of program completion, we have lots of supports and services in place for them. Those supports and services will continue on a very individualized basis for those students, but it's our students as a whole.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Hello.
There actually is a question in here, but
Okay.
I need to. Everyone speaks about how Carroll County schools are amazing and people move to our county in droves, but we are in a crisis in Carroll County. Some may not call it that, but what I see is a slow-moving train wreck. We're all here to learn about the blueprint and the impact on funding. As you've heard, Blueprint is yet another underfunded mandate brought to you by those who sit in Annapolis. Carroll County is broke. We have many capital improvement plans for CCPS that probably will not happen, including Freedom Elementary and Sykesville Middle. Liberty High School is also falling apart, and they do not have the funding to assist in rebuilding those schools. We are dealing with another crisis in our schools, and that's behaviors. Behaviors are out of control in every single school in the county. All educators in every school are trying to manage these behaviors, and the consequences is loss of instruction time. When I was in school and a child misbehaved, they were removed from the classroom. But now the entire class is moved and the child is left in the classroom to have their temper tantrum destroy the classroom. I have heard that CCPS pays $1 million fine yearly to the Maryland Board of Ed because we do not follow the rules that the Maryland Board of Education has instituted for our children. There are some people who are worried about a book or what is taught in health class, but if we don't get the behaviors in school under control soon, we won't have educators left to teach anything. I have one child that I am trying desperately to get through the school system safely. She is doing well because of the amazing educators that we have in this county. I'm here, I attend, I show up, and I talk to her teachers and try everything I can to give her the best. So when I come here and listen to you speak, my question is, what can we do? You have a captive audience. I'm listening. My friends are listening. What can we do as parents to have our children safely in school besides the blueprint and the funding?
That's a great question. And one thing I'll say is for those of you who are interested in student behaviors, what they're looking like, and how we're addressing that, we did a student behavior work session. Staff and our Board of Education, was it last week? And that the recording of that meeting is on our website. So if you have concerns about student behavior, please watch that. Watch that work session. We covered a lot of data and topics. And I think you'll be much better informed about where we are and what we need to do about it now and moving forward. One of my main concerns about what you just expressed, and I know that our teachers are feeling this way because they tell me, is let's say you're in a school where we have to remove some staff from that school and have them go to another school. I think what some people don't understand is Carroll County Public Schools has no fat. What I mean by that is over the past 15 to 20 years, we have cut everything that we have been able to cut in order to make our budget work. And so that includes over 300 instructional positions over the past 15 years. No other system in the state of Maryland had to do that or did that. And so now, and which because of that, we are ranked 24 out of 24 districts in the state of Maryland when you look at certain non-instructional positions per student. So we cut what some people call the low-hanging fruit, and we've cut the middle-hanging fruit, and now we're going to go for the high-hanging fruit to make our budgets work. And so when I talk to some of my colleagues who are superintendents in other systems, if they have to fund, let's say, School D on that slide that I showed that gets a lot of funding resources, they get the $7 million instead of the $4 million. The way that they are giving School D $7 million in resources is they're not taking anything from School A or any other school to give it to School D. They are reallocating money from places like central office. They are taking central office positions and they are reorganizing and putting those positions back out into the schools in the positions that are needed to fund School D. The problem is we cut all of those positions years and years ago when we had to in order to make our budget work. So when my colleague, let's say in Howard County, is looking at cutting lots of positions in central office and reorganizing the whole school system so that he can put more in School D, he can do that. I don't have the positions in central office to reorganize and reallocate from. So I have to take from School A to give to School D. It's the it's the unfortunate staffing situation that we find ourselves in, and it is frustrating. And I am with you that we are in a period of time where our kids have come back from COVID and we're seeing more complex needs than we have ever seen before. And right now, we're also in a place where we're going to have to be cutting in some places. And I do have concerns about that. And that's why, that's one of the reasons that we have Dr. Frank Grossman, our AIB facilitator, to make sure that he's looking at our budgets with us, he's communicating with the AIB, that I'm communicating with MSDE, and that everybody knows what we have to do in order to meet the requirements of Blueprint. So what I can say is that I have that concern with you, and I'm doing everything I can to communicate those concerns to people who might be able to make a difference for us. And I will continue to do that because, every school has to have what they need in order to function. And schools are needing more and more resources in order to function these days. So thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes.
Afternoon. Had a question now that you've mentioned all the numbers and stuff that are required and per student. After the school years begin, are you guys required then to be audited to say, okay, this is where we now stand? We thought we were having 5,000, but we're only having 4,000, for example, students. Mm-hmm. Will they then cut your budget to what student population is in that current school year?
Great question, John.
Yeah, very, very good question. So a couple of responses. We're required and going forward for the whole duration of the blueprint, the next 10 years or so, to report monthly expenditures by program to the state. And so they have a new state reporting system and an updated manual that should be out soon. And so every school system will be reporting expenditures, and then there'll be the baseline established this summer that Dr. McCabe's been talking about to sort of compare to. And you're right, it's the meat of your question gets to a lot of conversations we're having internally as staff, because it presents a bit of a different way of running schools than we've been accustomed to in Carroll County. At least we've tried to sort of take a lot of that the business thought process and workload off of the shoulders of principals, for better or worse, and said, here's your staffing, and it's based on some ratio of sort of an equal basis. This is more of a system of how much are you spending in this area and how much are you spending in that area and the next area, and where are you relative to that, and can I hire Nick in this program, or does he cost too much? I have to hire. It's a little bit like that. However, I think what I do hear with some frequency from state officials and you should understand, all of us who are the superintendent staff in this room are involved in an endless supply of meetings on the blueprint or just updates from our state counterparts, our peers, and folks in the state agencies. What I hear them saying more and more is there is an acknowledgement that you can never hit that nail on the head every year. People will go on leave. People will get sick. Things happen in time and life that would make it impossible to spend that exact amount. I think that's where you were kind of going with that. So I do think that they would expect that there would be some variance in any program from year to year, and that as long as it's a reasonable variance, they'll be okay with that. That would become a bit more work for us centrally, because I think they'll also expect that we account for that unspent funding in a given year, with the ideal that eventually it be spent back in the right program and time. And that's a whole different way of accounting for surpluses and budgets than we've ever had to do before. So that's kind of a new workload, but more of one centrally. So very astute question. I hope that answered it.
Yes. I also had one other question. I had heard that sometimes parents may request, okay, I know my students or my child is going to this school. I like to request them to go to another school. When this blueprint does eventually get into effect, and if I'm understanding, 2026, 2027, when that is official, is that going to be allowed? So first of all, is that true that you can request to have your student move one school to another? And if so, will that be null and void after 2026, 2027?
So it's true right now that you can get an out of district, what we call an out of district placement for your child if you would prefer your child to go to X middle school instead of Z middle school, or same with elementary or high school, as long as there are two caveats there. Number one, the school is not considered a closed school. So it's basically as long as it's not already considered overcrowded. Or number two, you also would have to provide the transportation. So those are the two caveats to that. We have talked about this question of out of district since we've known about Blueprint. As you can imagine, if there are certain schools that are maybe getting more resources than other schools, will people choose out of district to place their children in schools that have more resources? That's something that could happen. We have not made a decision yet about whether we will change our current out of district policy. When the board created the out of district policy, we thought it may create a lot of high school movement based on athletics. And it didn't really pan out that way. And in the end, what people said to us is most people like their neighborhood school. They like being with their friends and the kids that they have grown up with and that they live near. And so we never really saw the massive changes in out-of-district placements that we thought we would. So it's something that we're considering and not anything that we've made a final decision on yet. Great question.
Going along with the first half of his question, if we are doing monthly reporting to the state on a per pupil funding scenario, how is that impacted by shifts during the school year? If a student leaves or moves into the district, will our funding need to be changing month to month, or is that within the wiggle allowance we're assuming the state will allow?
It's not, good question. It's not that variable, however. So, I guess in terms of planning a budget and managing a budget, the good news is that the state uses a set date and time to establish enrollments for every category. So for most students, that's September 30th of a given year. And for a couple of the special student populations, it's about a month later. So the compensatory ed or the farm students are compiled usually at the end of October. So either September 30 or the end of October, they establish that baseline. If it changes after that, it's not something you have to go back and revisit. It's a hard-coded number from those fall dates.
Hi. So my question is, to me, this is more of, well, I guess I come from the public health spectrum. And I work in Howard County. So our health department, which is where I'm coming from, we have school-based wellness program. So this is where there are nurse practitioners within the schools. So it sounds very similar to your community schools. Okay. Is there, or are you already, is there an opportunity for partnerships with the health department, DCRS, like make it more of a kind of looking at other entities for help and just not just looking at the school system? That's my first question.
So yes, Mr. Shockney or Mr. Streaker, do either one of you want to talk about the partnerships that we're going to be developing with the health department and the, what do they call it? The wheels and the cogs? Spokes and cogs.
Well, While Mr. Streaker is coming up, I'll just elaborate a little bit on the community school model. For each school that's identified as a community school, we spend 1 year doing a needs assessment of that school and the needs of the community, and we structure those resources around, we develop a very clear plan and structure those resources around that needs assessment. That's more blueprint specific, but we partner in lots of different ways with community providers and agencies, and I'll turn things over to Mr. Streaker, our Director of Student Services, to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the hub and spoke model through the Maryland Consortium is where that comes from. There are 2 providers that have been selected through that process, which is not controlled by the school system. That's That's the Maryland State Department of Health, or MDH, actually organized that, which you're certainly aware. So those were in the development of MOUs with those agencies to serve throughout the county. But the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is in the community schools, those would be just those services within those schools. We do not have the model that you're speaking of in all of our school systems, where we bring in health providers. We do have some dental clinics. We do have some pieces like that, but we don't have anything scaled up to the level that you're speaking of right now.
I also, while we're on that topic, so part of what I do in Howard County, there is a website, and I'll do a plug. So it's called Care App. And what this is, we use, if you're familiar with Find Help, so this is a database. It's a nationwide database of resources. So Howard County has branded this Find Help. We call it Care App. And we connect resources, our clients or participants, people in the school system, with resources within the community. You can do it electronically, or we call it a logged referral, but either way, those resources are getting in the hands of the people that they need to be. And it's not just a printout paper that's going, it's a text message, it's an email. It can be changed into different languages for people. It's a great resource. I think it's something worth looking into, especially since we're talking about, again, I think this is more population health or public health. My next question would be about reporting. So we talked about short-term reporting, but as far as long-term, when does the state plan on looking at, well, to use school A and school D? How is school D doing with these new resources and versus how school A is doing with those resources being allocated somewhere else?
Yeah, before I let Mr. O'Neill answer that, I just want to share one thing. In Carroll County, we have the Partnership for a Healthier Carroll, which does offer on their website a similar resource that you're describing for folks to go to. So I'd encourage anybody who's interested in seeking resources in Carroll County to go to the Partnership for a Healthier Carroll. That's where we work. It's a collaborative effort through the health department and other agencies. Thank you.
Make sure Mr. Streaker got all of his public service announcements out. Great questions on sort of beyond the fiscal reporting part. So monthly fiscal reporting, annual looks at trends towards compliance. At the same time, what you're talking about sort of measurable outcomes, that's also part of the planning process. So it's all part of one plan. The templates available on the AIB's website, our working draft is not yet publicly available, but essentially every school system will be reporting by the 5 pillars of the blueprint that Dr. McCabe outlined earlier. And in addition to pillar 5 is sort of the compliance piece or the governance piece. That's where the fiscal accountability component will be. We didn't highlight that as its own pillar tonight. But each of the pillars themselves will have measurable targets over multiple years for achievement. And so there'll be appendices with data tables and all of those kinds of things. And what the AIB would be asking us and MSD would be asking us is to set some multi-year growth measures that we're going to strive to achieve. And they're now describing it with this new template as kind of being a living document. You're going to modify it year over year. But somewhere roughly, with the draft still underway, somewhere roughly in the 3-year range, we're going to look for outcomes 1, 2, and 3 years out, knowing that we can revisit them annually. So it's all in one place. It's what are we trying to achieve and how are we doing in terms of those student achievement outcomes, And over here, it's how are we doing in terms of our fiscal compliance and what is our plan to get there too. So it's a one-stop shop for all things blueprint in the annual plan. I'm gonna do like
Yes, come on up.
Hi, semi in line with using resources and connecting with resources that are in the community. I can preface by saying that I worked in the school system prior to Sandy Hook, so I lived in the beautiful Carroll County school system that we had, that was very collaborative and very open. Since Sandy Hook and since the other events that have happened since then, the school has had to take security precautions, etc. Policy has changed, and so has the ability for the community to assist in the education of our students in the schools. Most recently, as a part of the Bonds Meadow Rotary Club, we had prior to this year been able to donate dictionaries to third graders and bring them into the third graders and read to them and read to the kindergartners and things of that nature. As a community organization, we were participating in the assistance of educating our kids in the schools. Something's changed. I haven't researched what, but we weren't able to do that this year. So with the understanding that resources are strained and you're going to need additional collaboration from the community to help meet the needs of the students, I guess I would ask to reflect and see if you can't make sure part of Pillar 3 is including the community in not only the public resources that may be available, but also the community resources. There are people here ready to assist with implementation and making sure our students are ready. And I don't know that there's a mechanism to help us help you.
Right. Yes, and what you're talking about is a certain circumstance that we're working through this year. And I would ask that you would see Mr. Shockney when the meeting is over, and he can fill you in on our partnerships and the changes that we've had to make over the course of the last couple of years. But we still do want to work collaboratively and in partnership with our community resources. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions? Yes.
Good evening. So, myself, having come from a family who was economically, disadvantaged, as you put it, I appreciate some of the things that are funded. I had a hot lunch, every day because of it. So I appreciate that. But with that said, at what point, because we're talking money, we're talking jobs, at what point do we look at these projections? How do we quantify this, the outcome when this money is being allocated over here for this group who may be, socioeconomically disadvantaged, to get to the same level as everyone else, that, it's equity, not equality, as you put it. But at what point do we start looking at, okay, how are we quantifying this? How are we putting that into measurement to make sure that that money is being used wisely, that these children are progressing the way that these numbers are anticipating? And how do we avoid things like God Love Baltimore, but they're dumping money into those schools? We've got these kids graduating that can't read on a third grade level. How do we keep that from happening here? Because people are saying, well, if we don't show that these kids are maintaining this, we're not going to get that funding. We're not going to have this job. And that may sort of cause people to let their ethics drop a little bit. So that's my question.
Mr. O'Neill, can you take a stab at that one? Good question.
I'll do my best, and part of the answer goes back to the prior question about where are outcomes other than fiscal reporting, and they're all in the same document, in the same plan. And so it's certainly not our desire, our superintendent's desire, to forsake achievement at one site to increase achievement at another site. And so, a lot of strategic thinking goes into that. We've talked a lot about the reallocation of money that's already somewhere in the system. We're also, as long as our population's growing, and right now Carroll County is in a much different place than we have been for a long time. Our student population appears to be growing fairly steadily into the future. So as long as there are more students, we're also receiving new money each year. based on the formula that Dr. McCabe had on the screen. And so we have been intentionally spending the new funding we receive from the state under the blueprint for the purposes we know they wish us to spend it. And so we had $11.3 million in new compensatory ed money from the state for this year. Mr. Shockney and his team put together a plan to sort of identify some of our schools that have a higher percentage of farms or compensatory ed students and deploy new resources into those schools. And so that was year one. And step one, Nick and his folks now will be taking a look each year to say, okay, how well have those resources worked? And at the end of the day, this entire plan is almost like a puzzle where you're trying to slide all the pieces together and make your case. How are we achieving? But we don't want achievement to go down anywhere. How have these strategies we've tried worked, and we've reassessed them, and maybe we can deploy them a little bit differently and gain some economy of scale, those sorts of things. So all of that work is ongoing, and all of it will be in an ongoing way part of our annual plan we're turning into the state. It's an annual plan with 3 or 4 year measurable outcomes, but we can relook at it every year. Nick might want to talk a little bit about those resources.
Mr. O'Neill, you said that perfectly. And nothing is set in stone. While we have fiscal compliance requirements, what we spend that money on can be fluid, and we are always using data to evaluate the progress of the strategies and interventions that we're implementing. If things are working, great. We're going to build or maybe move on to something else. If something's not working, we're going to do a root cause analysis, try to figure out why, and strategize. So there's nothing, while we have to be compliant fiscally, the what we do with those funds can change and will change. Again, all rooted and grounded in our plan and what we think is going to work. We're going to monitor that very closely with progress data. If we make progress, great. If we don't, we'll reevaluate and go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to the behavior question in relation to staff and all of this. So I know that there are clearly other additional needs that have been exacerbated by this situation over the last few years, but it also comes down to we have less staff and less hands helping, less people to help deal with situations in an effective way to keep all of the kids safe and everyone able to learn and all of that. We also have a tough time recruiting because we pay less than counties that are nearby. And I've heard that that's going to get exacerbated by this because when we meet the $60,000 minimum, some of the nearby counties are going to exceed the minimum. So we're working with less staff and we're going to be paying less than neighboring counties and everything. So how are we going to keep our staff and make sure that they want to stay here and working? And especially in those schools like School A, where now they're getting less resources. We're already as lean as we can be, but now those schools are going to have even less, and they're going to be looking at their colleagues who are getting more help, and that help is coming from their building. So how do we keep staff happy and capable of doing their jobs and wanting to stay here and do everything they can for our kids? And how do we as parents help support that so that our kids are not losing all of the staff and the teachers and the opportunities when this all happens?
Well, you just described why I have more gray hair and why I wake up at 3 a.m. and can't go back to sleep. But we meet about this and talk about this daily. What you just mentioned is one of our top priorities here. Blueprint is meant to highlight the profession of teaching and get more people interested in teaching. And we can't do that if, even though we meet the 60, surrounding counties go above that. And, we know that the counties that surround us, Baltimore County, Howard County, Frederick County, all pay more than we do right now. And when I talk to their superintendents, we always talk about salaries and what we're doing. So that has always been something that has challenged us here in Carroll County, but it's something that we are actively working on now. And folks have always, I think, appreciated coming to Carroll County from other locations because, by and large, our students come to school ready to learn. And so sometimes a lot of the challenges you might face in another district, you don't face as much or as often here in Carroll County. Our families are supportive. Our students come to school ready to learn. But as we mentioned earlier, since, even before the pandemic, but really after the pandemic, we are seeing more and more complex needs of our students, especially those who are coming to us for pre-K and K. And so what we are doing is trying to find ways to get the resources where they need to be when students first come to us, and try to meet those needs there in the very young so that as they move forward, they're in a much better place and ready to learn. That's our goal. It takes a lot of resource and it takes a lot of planning on our part. But please know that we are right there with you in your thinking, and that is one of our first priorities, is how to make teaching something that people want to do, especially in Carroll County. And we know that salary is part of that, and then working conditions are the other part of it. So thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight and asking all the thoughtful questions that you've asked. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to stay after and talk, and we will be here. We have cabinet members here who can answer any other questions that you might have. Thanks, and have a good evening.